My name is Palisa Madi from the Center for Applied Legal Studies. Just a reminder to please mute yourself and to please tweet. Remember the hashtag is #POGUE2021. I have the pleasure this morning of introducing our keynote speaker, Dr. Mbethe, who is the Program Director of Apolitical Academy Southern Africa, the nonprofit and nonpartisan political training program for emerging public leaders in Southern Africa. She's a senior lecturer in the Department of Political Sciences at the University of Pretoria, where she teaches international relations and South African politics. She's a visiting researcher at the African Leadership Center at King's College London and is a member of the Joint Academic Committee of the Joint PhD Program in Leadership and Security Studies. She's a member of the Council of the Private Security Industry Regulatory Authority and served as a member of the Ministerial Advisory Committee on the Electoral System. She sits on the board of Amabongani Center for Investigative Journalism and the Social Justice Initiative. Without any further delay, Dr. Mbethe, over to you.
Thank you so much, Palisa, for that really generous welcome, and thank you to Pilk for inviting me to come and speak today and to give the keynote address. It's a great honor to be here with all of you. Unfortunately, online and virtual. It would have been great to have this as an in-person event, but these are the times that we are living in. I am really grateful and honored to be invited to speak to you all here today. And as with all sort of government things, you get used to saying all protocol observed. So hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here. I have been asked to reflect a bit on the theme of this year's conference, which is reflections on defending and advancing social justice during the COVID-19 pandemic in South Africa. And I was asked to speak a bit on this, to provide my thoughts on how we firstly take stock of what has happened over the past 18 months with the COVID-19 pandemic and the work, very important work that has been done by the social justice sector during this time, but also asked to then reflect a bit on what the future holds. Everybody keeps speaking about a post-COVID world or life after COVID-19. We won't have life after COVID-19. I think certainly what this period, especially in this past few months as vaccines have become more accessible to us, has shown is that there isn't going to be a real break with this, between what came before COVID and what's going to come afterwards, but rather COVID-19 is going to be a lingering, ever-present threat or feature of our lives going into the future, and it's going to be far more about how we manage it and how we manage the consequences of it in the coming years. And so I think it's too early, possibly even a decade too early, to be talking about a life after COVID. But rather what we need to be talking about is, well, what is life with COVID going to look like in the next few years? And what does that mean for the social justice sector? And so just to, you don't need, I'm sure, much of this background, but we are meeting today on the 577th day of the state of disaster, which began in South Africa on the 15th of March 2020. It is highly likely from this vantage point that the declaration of disaster will be renewed tomorrow night, the 14th of October, so that we will continue with the state of disaster from the 15th of October, which is Friday. And the state of disaster was declared at a time when it became clear that no country would be spared from the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. I was reading as I was researching for today, and I looked up the article in the Financial Times of Arundhati Roy that she wrote in April of 2020, where she made her famous, what's become coined the famous phrase that the pandemic is a portal to a new, more equitable life, and it could be that for all of us. And at the start of that article, which was published on the 3rd of April 2020, she said that the number of cases worldwide has this week crept over 1 million. This was in April, the beginning of April of 2020. And the 13th of October of 2021, the world has seen over 200 million cases of the 219 million cases of COVID-19, which has caused 4.5 million deaths worldwide. In South Africa, we have seen 2.91 million cases, and officially over 88,000 deaths in that time. But as many statisticians and health practitioners and public health specialists have said, that with our excess deaths between May 2020 and July 2021 sitting at about 220,000, the real number of people who have died of COVID-19 is probably far higher than that official number of around 90,000. I raise all of these numbers in order to make the point that we are living and working in a time of extreme loss, grief, and trauma. And this is in a country where loss, grief, and trauma really are the norm of many people's everyday lives, given the very high rates of crime that we have, the high burden of disease, and the poverty and inequality that characterize the lives of the majority of South Africans. But even with that, this period of the past 18 months has been particularly difficult in terms of the extent of loss that people have felt in their families, with whole families being devastated by COVID-19, particularly in this third wave that's just ended now, but also the loss of a way of life. And a sense of normality, and also the trauma of living in a context where everybody around you is losing people, livelihoods, and opportunities. And so this is the context in which we are doing the very difficult work of social justice. And I think that needs to be acknowledged up front. What also needs to be acknowledged up front is that it seems as though those conditions of trauma, of loss, of grief are going to be with us for the foreseeable future. Hopefully within a year or so, things will have stabilized if everybody gets their vaccines and we find a way to manage this disease. But certainly this period, this uncertainty that we have all been living with is going to be with us for a while, and it's something that we need to wrap our heads around as we think of our own inner reserves in terms of doing this work, but also in terms of the communities that we work with. In thinking of my reflections today, and sort of how the social justice sector has responded to the pandemic and how it may adapt to life with COVID-19, I identified 3 points that I'd like to discuss today. Balisa and I, when we spoke yesterday, agreed that I would try to keep it to 30 minutes. Looking at my time now, I'll probably push that to 40 and then be able to open up for discussion and questions and comments. The 3 things I'd like to, or the 3 themes basically that I've structured my remarks around is, firstly, the statement that people live locally, not nationally. Or put it another way, people sleep locally, not nationally. And this quote came from a City of Johannesburg councillor at a pre-elections event I spoke at last week. And they made that point while making the case for why local government is the most important sphere of government, because we experience the state, we experience, or our life experiences happen at the local level. And what does that then mean for how we think of our work as social justice institutions? The second point and the second theme that I'd like to talk around is about thinking of public interest law beyond litigation. What does it mean to be advocates for social justice, to engage in legal work in the public interest outside of litigating rights-based cases? And then the third theme I would like to speak about, or the third point I would like to make, is about making economic justice the central pillar of social justice. And I think that this is particularly important given the economic situation that is facing most South Africans. So those are the three themes I'll be speaking about. So getting to the first one, around this idea that people live locally and not nationally. So what this means for most of us, and for us, is that for all people, our quality of life is determined by what we experience in our immediate environment, in our immediate surrounds. So the quality of our housing, the quality and reliability of our water supply, the reliability of our electricity. I'm here speaking to you from one of these rented shared office spaces because there's no electricity in my house. So the reliability of our electricity supply, whether the garbage is collected, do our street lights work, does our local clinic, our police station function? Those very local areas of service delivery determine our living environments and the quality of our life as people. And we often forget that in our focus on the policies that are made at the national level. Yes, of course, many of the things that I've described that impact our local lives are determined by decisions and policies made at the national level. But we experience them locally in our homes and in our communities. And the reality is that over the past 27 years, the democratic experience for most South Africans at that local level has been one of poverty, of unemployment, and of exclusion. And of not having the resources and the services that are required for people to live a decent life and a life that is characterized by dignity. And this certainly is not, and COVID-19 has only exacerbated the trifecta of South African challenges of inequality, unemployment, and poverty. And certainly this isn't just a South African problem. Oxfam, in one of their recent reports, referred to COVID as the inequality virus and said that it has, and I quote, exposed, fed off, and increased existing inequalities of wealth, gender, and race. But for a country like South Africa that already before COVID-19 was the most unequal country in the world in terms of our Gini coefficient, which already had an extremely high level of unemployment, which has reached its peak in the second quarter of this year, and where stark poverty and stark wealth, those extremes live together in that Time magazine cover from a few years ago that showed a very wealthy area next to an informal settlement, and inside the magazine had pictures of Alex on one side, or Seshego, particularly in Alex on one side, and Santon on the other, where we live with stark inequality in our faces all the time. COVID-19 has made a situation that we didn't think could get worse even worse. And a lot of that is experienced by people at community level. And certainly social justice organizations responded quickly in the wake of the state of disaster and the lockdown in March, April last year, to make sure that they could keep playing an important role in supporting communities. So many organizations set up remote operations. They set up COVID-19 hotlines in order to enable ordinary people to report what was going on in their communities. They used WhatsApp in order to stay connected and to continue to provide support to communities across the country. Certainly with SJI, where I am a board member, with the support that we were giving to social justice organizations, a lot of the focus of our interventions was on firstly enabling communities to deal with the emerging human rights violations during the crisis, and to ensure that communities could access justice. The second point of emphasis was on addressing gender-based violence and offering psychosocial services to communities. The third was around enabling food security because of the loss of incomes in many homes with the lockdown, but also the cessation of things like school feeding schemes that so many children rely on when the schools were closed immediately after the lockdown. And then fourth was in monitoring the delivery of services, particularly those that were promised by the state to support people during the COVID-19 crisis. The South African government, like many others in the developing world, chose to, and to a certain extent in the developed world, chose to take a security approach to managing the pandemic, emphasizing punitive measures to keep people at home. And what that meant is that for those who live in crowded townships and informal settlements where staying at home and social distancing isn't an option, and for children who didn't have internet at home and so couldn't learn at home, and so occupied themselves by playing in the streets and engaging outside of the home. They, instead of the state adopting an approach that understands the circumstance under which people live, they were punished for it. And we saw most prominently the murder of Collins Khosa, which was just one example of state violence against civilians, apparently in the service of protecting those same civilians from a virus. And so this kind of violent and punitive approach to COVID-19 that we saw from the state was certainly something that many social justice organizations took up and provided assistance to communities in dealing with it. And for me, what we saw with both the army and the police services were doing in terms of maintaining order during COVID-19 was such a stark contrast to President Ramaphosa. I don't know if you remember when he made this big show dressed in his military uniform as Commander-in-Chief of the armed forces, and he publicly instructed the army to be nice to us and not to act with violence. But the reality is that even though there was this show by the national leader of the country, people live and act locally, beyond the view of cameras and beyond the view of national politicians. And so knowing that, and having been shown this so starkly with COVID-19, and as we think about building better, which is the title of the most recent World Bank report on South Africa, Building Better After COVID-19. How does our work in the social justice sector impact at the local level? What kind of initiatives, what kind of mechanisms do we need to put in place in our own work to strengthen the ability of communities to live with COVID-19, to hold their government and administrators accountable for the services, for the work that they do and for the services that they provide, but also to be able to improve their livelihoods and the quality of lives at the local level. And I think this is something particularly important to think about as we go towards the local government elections, which are in 2 weeks, just over 2 weeks, is what are the initiatives that we as the social justice sector need to be taking at a local level to improve people's way of life. I think that and this is getting me now to my second point about thinking of public interest law beyond litigation. So much of the social justice sector, and I think because of the kind of grand corruption that we've seen at the national level, but also the failure of the implementation of national policies, so much of the emphasis of the social justice sector has been on influencing the policy making at national level, often using rights-based litigation and using the courts in order to enforce the rights that are in the Constitution. So from the late 90s, early 2000s with the Grootboom case to the Treatment Action Campaign cases on providing antiretroviral drugs, to more recent cases like the one, like the Michael Komape case around, providing proper sanitation in schools, or the Social Justice Coalition's recent case against the police in the Western Cape around the allocation of police resources. Social justice organizations have effectively used the judicial system to assert people's rights. And this is a good thing. And I think that this has been a very valuable contribution of the social justice sector to South African democracy. However, this is not enough. Mayor Irene Grootboom died without a house in 2008. The different provincial health departments and district departments have not been able to provide sanitation in a large number of the schools that didn't have adequate sanitation at the time that that Michael Komape died, and in effect was murdered due to negligence, right? He was killed by a negligent state. And we see many other examples of where cases are won in the courts, but the remedial kind of actions and what's supposed to happen afterwards never materializes because of a failure of state capacity and sometimes of political will to ensure that what needs to be done is actually done, and that services are provided. So I think that the social justice sector needs to think about what happens beyond litigation. How can the sector make sure that there is continuous, sustainable, and effective provision of the services that have been won often through the through litigation and through the courts. And I want to suggest sort of 3 areas to think about. The first is around state capacity, and particularly around professionalizing the civil service. The second one is around utilizing advice officers, not just to advise communities, but to also help communities hold local officials accountable. And the third thing is about, the third point I want to make is around engaging legislatures and legislators effectively. So on state capacity, South Africa has a major crisis of state capacity. The reason, you always hear South Africa has great policies and they're not, but implementation is poor. And the reason why implementation is poor is that we haven't paid any attention to the fundamental aspects and needs of administration, of execution in the state since 1994. There's been a lot of emphasis on policies, on having the right laws in place, but not much emphasis, and even in political science departments and public administration departments at universities, we teach students a lot about policy making, but we don't teach students about policy implementation. And a lot of the policy implementation is the non-sexy things, right? It's the project management, it's the kind of industrial engineering stuff of how do you actually design processes that will lead to particular outcomes, and that will ensure that will make it easier to actually effect policy and implement it in order to get the outcome that you want. And because of that neglect of administration, it means that even though there are many areas of government, of the state, at national, at provincial, and at local level, where we have many dedicated civil servants in the system, those civil servants aren't adequately empowered and resourced to do their jobs, and are often subject to political interference. One of the notable things for me from the Zondo Commission, despite all the, there was lots of tea spilled at the Zondo Commission and lots of gossipy things to hear about, but was how speaker after speaker, in their description of what enabled the corruption to happen in their different areas of work, was how the systems of the state just didn't function or collapsed, or it was possible to undermine them in order to then use the administration to enrich the few. In a former life, I worked in the Secretariat of the National Planning Commission when we were writing the National Development Plan, and worked specifically on Chapter 13 of the National Development Plan, which is focused on building the official title of that chapter is building a capable and developmental state. And what that part of the National Development Plan speaks about is about how South Africa needs to build a state that's capable of playing a developmental and transformative role. It argues that the public service needs to be immersed in the development agenda, but insulated from undue political interference. Amongst some of the suggestions that are made in that part of the National Development Plan is, firstly, that staff at all levels must have the authority, experience, and support they need to do their jobs. And that this will require a long-term approach to skills development. Secondly, we need to improve relations between the national, provincial, and local government through a proactive approach to resolving the coordination problems at those 3 spheres. Our the Constitution says that our system is based on cooperative governance, and there is the assumption that there will be coordination between the national, provincial, and the local level. But what we've all known, what we've all experienced through our work is that very often there is no coordination between these three spheres of government, and they often work at cross purposes. And then finally, what I want to highlight from the NDP is around the governance structures for state-owned enterprises. And what the NDP says is that they should be simplified to ensure clear lines of accountability and stable leadership. Now, there has been in recent, in the past 3 years or so, since Cyril Ramaphosa took over as the president of the Republic, an emphasis on professionalizing the civil service. The National School of Government, which has been formally established, released a white paper a few months ago around professionalizing the civil service, or professionalizing the public service, and linked to that, and as part of that, looking at creating, stable career paths for public service, for public servants, insulating the administration from politics, and improving the technical skills that we have within the administration. But those are still ideas, and I'd encourage everybody to read that implementation framework towards professionalizing the public service. But it's not clear that there is the political will to actually implement it in its entirety. And so I think there's a question around how can social justice organizations support the work of public administrators, especially in the face of political pressure? And what kind of campaigns can be built around the agenda to professionalize the civil service? Because it doesn't matter how much work we do around mobilization and raising awareness of fighting battles in court, if we have a state that remains incapable of actually implementing and doing what needs to be done to improve people's lives, our work then remains a fool's errand. And I'm not suggesting that social justice organizations become implementers, right? I think that there's, government very often likes to think of civil society as kind of beneficiaries and implementers of certain government programs. That's not what I'm suggesting at all. I think that there needs to be independence of social justice organizations, and that the tension between independent civil society and government is a healthy one and can be a creative one. But I do think that we need to think of other ways of cooperation that can support the development of a state that is capable and can actually implement all of the lofty goals of the Bill of Rights, but also of many of the laws that we have on our statute books. On the 7th of September, Daily Maverick published a piece by Mark Hayward, where he was reflecting on state capacity and how civil society can support state capacity. And at some point in that article, he says, and I quote directly, "So yes, dear comrades, an independent civil society, just like the media, is an essential but insufficient part of good governance. It is not an end in itself. An independent and strong civil society squaring up against a perpetually weak state will never deliver social justice. Faced with a broken state, we must admit that critique is easier than reconstruction. Policy advocacy is easier than policy implementation. Our job is to hoe the hard row. It's time to get our hands dirty again, close quote. And I think just to close up on that section, that there's a government official and politicians actually especially make a big thing around public participation and creating an active citizenry, but that is meaningless without a responsive state. If the state does not respond to that activity of the citizenry, to that participation of the citizenry, then there's something wrong then in that relationship, and you won't achieve any change. And so what can we do in order to help capacitate government to become responsive in the way that we need to do so? The second point, and linked to that, is the very important role of community advice officers. And I was struck in the early days of the pandemic last year, in some of the dialogues that SJI organized, about how important advice officers were in enabling communities to access justice, enabling communities to access resources and to know where to go to receive the help that they needed during this time, during the period of COVID-19. And it seems to me that having active, resourced advice officers and communities across the country is something that we need to emphasize as those who are interested in social justice. And it's the kind of non-sexy part of access to administrative justice, right? It's the part that happens on a day-to-day basis, and that needs to be active, I think, for people to then be able to hold local politicians and local officials accountable, but then also for them to then be able to access the resources that they need if things are going to go further to litigation at a later stage. So what is the role of community advice officers within the social justice sector, and how do we capacitate them and resource them to enable them to play an effective role? And then the final point I want to make is with regards to public interest law, and thinking of public interest law beyond litigation, is that it is very important for us to engage legislatures and legislators in the course of our work. And I think certainly during, I think it was particularly acute during the Zuma years, but it was also the case during the Mbeki years, less so during the Mandela years, was this very tense relationship between independent civil society organizations and politicians in parliament, in different provincial legislatures and in councils, in local councils, and this adversarial, antagonistic relationship between civil society and politicians at that level. And while I think that there can be a purpose to that kind of adversarial relationship, for holding politicians account, etc. I think that social justice organizations have a wealth of information that can be used to enable politicians in legislatures to be better at doing their jobs. And so more engagement with the legislative process as laws are being made, I think is important for social justice to do, but not just at the period of the public participation that Parliament will open, that provincial legislatures will open, or that council will open as a matter of law, but while they are discussing particular laws. But I think routine engagement with the different committees in Parliament, for example, around how legislation is actually being implemented. So if there was a court case on pit toilets and that found that the state has to provide adequate sanitation at all schools, how much are we as social justice organizations then informing Parliament, informing individual MPs in Parliament of the of the progress on that on a regular basis, once a quarter, let's say, and how much are we engaging with individual legislators, MPs, and councillors, MPLs, in order to push some of our own agenda in our campaigns, but also to let them know how things are actually happening on the ground. There's a lot wrong with the American political system. Most of it is wrong, and American democracy is nothing to aspire to. However, I do think one of the strengths of that system, when it works well, is the ability of organizations to engage with individual legislators in order to impact on their work in the bigger legislatures that they work within. So how can we think of doing that as social justice? And then just a final point, and I think I'm not going to belabor this point because it's going to be made, the discussion that's going to follow me around the basic income grant and grants in general, I think we'll go into this far more. We are in a country with a restricted, limited definition of 34.4% unemployment. If you expand it, it's well over 40%. Young people have a 70% unemployment rate. Indicators of poverty have been are going backwards and have been reversed over the past 18 months. People are getting poorer, and inequality is growing within our society. And it is almost impossible to achieve the goals that are set out in our constitution without dealing with the economic circumstances that people are living under, and without achieving economic justice for the majority of South Africans. And so I think that as we think about our work as a social justice sector going into the future, or going just in the short term, in the next 1 to 2 years, and in the medium term of sort of 5 to 7 years, we really need to think about putting economic justice at the center of our work, and at the center of our engagement with the state and holding the state accountable. I will end it there. I spoke for about 42 minutes. And I'll just allow them for any questions and comments. Thanks, Dalisa.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mbethe. We have a few minutes for some questions. My suggestion is that we post any comments on the chat box instead. I've noted a question already from the chat box from Loreti Mumba. Loreti, are you happy to come and put your camera on and ask your question? You can go ahead.
Okay, hi. I hope I'm able to articulate as well as I wrote it. But I was just listening to you when you were talking about how we teach policy implementation, but not actually how to implement the policies. So my question was asking, how does that work in lieu of the fact that you also mentioned that there's a lot of red tape in place preventing people from actually enacting administrative change? So will teaching students play any role, and how will it actually change or cause any effects in light of our current governmental and political situation? It's also written there for you, but thank you so much.
Great. Thanks so much for that question. I think that what I was trying to get across in terms of what blocks a lot of implementation is often what we call, or what seems like, red tape, is an inability for administrators to actually implement what has been put in place in policy. So if you think of your environmental assessments, for example, and small business people will say that, you can't do, or any business people say you can't do anything or make new investment because of these environmental impact assessments, and it's an unnecessary piece of red tape. The reason why there's nothing inherent in the policy that says that environmental impact assessment should take 2 years. The reason why they take 2 years is because there is no, there's often not the human infrastructure, so there aren't the people to do the work. And when the people are there, there isn't all the other resources that they require to actually be able to do their work, whether that is the vehicles to be able to get somewhere to go do the actual impact assessment. You find in smaller municipalities, there isn't the printing paper to be able to print things. And so red tape often becomes red tape because the administrative systems are not working. And so when I say that we don't teach policy implementation, firstly, we don't teach project management. So how do you manage a big project from inception to completion? But secondly, how do you think of, as a policymaker or as an administrator, how do you think of the systems to make sure that there's always printer paper, that there is always ink in the printers that need ink, that cars are repaired when they need to be repaired, so that work can be done. And so it's literally that level of basic doing of things, and all of us in our organization do those things and make sure that that happens, that's actually missing in our government. I'm not talking about anything bigger than that. And so I hope that assists with, yeah, and just to also say, because then those systems don't work, it then becomes very easy for politicians to interfere in the work of administrators, and to interfere in the way in which resources are distributed within different levels of government and within government departments, because the administrators aren't empowered to be able to challenge that from the politicians, just in a basic way of having the adequate resources to do their work. Thank you.
Thank you. Alison?
Morning. So I wondered if you'd had any experience of the National School of Government, and any idea on how it's doing and what it's doing. Its website is down. And whether it would be useful for us to engage them, and if so, what the sort of priority issues might be. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks. So the National School of Governance is operational. It is up and running under the custodianship of Busani Ngawene, who was he worked in the presidency for a long time, he was senior official in the presidency for a long time. But it's also facing a number of challenges in terms of, firstly, its place in relation to the rest of the administration and in relation to government as a whole. Secondly, it's facing challenges in terms of sustainability and resourcing. So government departments are meant to pay for their officials to go through the programs of the National School of Government. But there's a lot of uncertainty around the sustainability of that model. So it's not like they are funded directly out of the treasury. And I think that's something that needs to be resolved. And then the other thing about the National School of Government that I think is something to think about is really about how binding or how much of a role or right it has to get involved in the administration of different parts of government, and to enforce certain types of training and qualifications for people at different levels in government. I do know that a successful part of their, something that has been successfully implemented is an entrance exam for all people that want to join the senior management service of government. And so you need to write this exam on a number of things related to being a senior manager in government, but it hasn't been implemented for lower levels. And then, of course, the final thing is that how much the National School of Government has jurisdiction or is accessible, especially to local level officials, isn't clear. At the moment, I still have the sense that it operates at national and provincial level. But I know that they are in a period of kind of very open engagement at the moment, both around the implementation framework for professionalization of the public service. And I think even just trying to approach Busani directly, who's the head of the National School of Government, to see where you can contribute knowledge. I think particularly, Alison, with the work that you guys are doing on open government, right, and the OGP, how to try and engage with them about how that can fit into their offering, I think would be great to do. Yeah.
Thank you. There was another question from Lisa. Lisa, you can go ahead.
Thanks, Melissa. And Dr. Mbethe, thank you so much for your thoughts and reflections. They've been incredibly useful for us. I wanted to pick up on the point you'd been making about the need for us to move beyond litigation and to think about the use of public interest law in different ways. And I'm so glad you raised it, because it's something that the PILG Steering Committee has been working on this year to make sure that even the language and branding of this event is more inclusive and moves beyond litigation. Because I've heard a lot of people who've been working in the social justice sector over the last year or two reflect that one of the things that has been surprising about our work during this time is that at least sometimes and some pockets and in some issues, the state has been experienced as far more responsive than it is in ordinary times. And maybe that's been because things are a little bit more centralized than usual. Oh, there may be a whole host of reasons for that. So I mean, I'm interested in your thoughts. Is that an assessment you would agree with? If so, kind of what do you think's going on there? Or are there things we should be thinking about that we can leverage, or lessons that we've learned about advocacy work during a time of a pandemic that can take us forward? Thanks.
Thanks so much for that question, Lisa. I agree with you that yes, the state has been more responsive in some respects during the COVID-19 pandemic, and more responsive to input from the outside than what would perhaps be seen normally. I think that part of it is just the nature of the pandemic itself, right? That everybody needs to be, the sense that everyone's pulling in the same kind of direction and trying to, and so we are engaging really as partners, trying to address the issues around this particular I hate the war language around pandemics or around disease, right? That we're fighting the same fight and we're battling the same enemy, whatever. But that we're all on the same team. And so I think that there's been an openness from legislators and administrators that comes from seeing the social justice sector as a partner rather than an adversary. But in the same way, I think that social justice sector has approached government differently than usual, than in non-COVID times. That it's been an approach that's been we want you to succeed in this, because if you fail us here, then millions of people are going to die. So we are approaching you with a spirit of cooperation, of camaraderie, and don't you want to try these ideas or to deal with this? So that the relationship on both sides, I think, has been less adversarial than usual. And this has been an important contributor, I think, to enabling the response of the state to certain initiatives from the social justice sector. And I think that is something to then, and I'm glad to hear that the PILG steering group is thinking about this, is to then identify what, and I don't have the answers to this, but to identify what was it that was different in this last 18 months about the way that we approached government, and who we spoke to and how we spoke to them, and what of that can we carry after COVID-19 stops being the kind of big health crisis that it is. COVID-19 will always be there, but what can we carry with us when it stops being, when we stop being in this state of disaster and the state of crisis? And how can we then leverage the relationships also? Because I think that what COVID-19 has also allowed for is for civil society organizations to build relationships with government. And whether that is through organization or mechanisms like the Solidarity Fund or whatever. So how do you carry those relationships forward, I think, is going to be an important thing for you guys to all discuss. I'm just seeing in the chat that Mbethe has raised the Mbethe raised the thing on the different training academies that provinces had. Yes. I think that engaging, and I do think that there's a willingness and an openness amongst the leadership of the National School of Government to create a coherent vision for public service. And so I really encourage both PARI and other interested organizations to approach the leadership of the National School of Government to talk through these issues, because also civil society organizations see things at provincial and local level that national administrators do not. And so I think your knowledge of this is hugely, of the sector, I think would be hugely useful. And I see Lauren's made the point that we've experienced an openness in engagement, but the implementation record is as poor as ever, if not poorer. And so finding champions in the state has been a useful strategy, she says. And so and the point is that when we think about the implementation, it's back to the state capacity. Are the right people in the right positions at the right levels in the state? And in many parts of our state, they are not. And so how can we think about what can social justice organizations do to campaign and to lobby for the right people to be put in the right places so that things can actually get done? Thank you.
Dr. Mbethe, a very, very warm thank you for your time and for your reflections this morning. You've left us with much to think about and several quite practical steps and ideas that we can take forward in our work. Thank you to everyone. Please note that we will be back at 11:15. Now we have 15 minutes for a short tea break, and the next session will be on the update on the PILG hotline. Thank you so much, everyone.